Under our first module, again, which is called creating a high performance, which is what you do first in corporate, right? You build your team, right? I don't know how many of y'all have been at this level or not, but if you have, feel free to speak up because I'll share my experiences so this will make sense. But I also need you to share your experiences if you've been down this route before, running a project. Within creating a high performing team with the course content, the first thing you do is build your team. That makes sense, right? It didn't used to say that with the old exam. The next thing you want to do is define team rules, because once you get a group of people together, you need some rules in place. If you're autocratic and working by yourself, that's easy. But just because you think you're cool, everybody else doesn't. So there has to be team ground rules amongst 15, 20 people. Then you want to negotiate project agreements. Well, what type of agreements? We'll get to that in a second. You as a servant leader and as a transformational leader that's over that project, you want to empower your team and the stakeholders along with it. We'll talk about the distinction between those. And there's not, well, then you want to train your team members and your stakeholders, you meaning you, the project manager. Then you want to engage and support virtual teams, which we've already done now because of COVID, right? And then your job is to also build a shared understanding about whatever project that you're governing or being a servant leader to, right? So this is our module, and these are the topics under that module. There's 7 of them. But this is key. There's not a lot to this, but building a shared understanding about a project, that's one of our primary tasks as project managers, right? Because if we don't continuously, and people ask that, but if we don't continuously spit out that vision, I do it at every single meeting as a reminder. And I make sure, individually and the clear roles and responsibilities. You'd be surprised when you're really leading a project. I've led some big ones that people don't, you think they know their roles, but what you have to remember is they're probably working on other projects as well, right? And you think they know the role in your project. Well, when they leave your meeting, they got to go somewhere else to another project meeting, right? So keep reaffirming that. That's one of the huge, it's not a challenge, but it's a reminder to ourselves. We mentioned the charter yesterday. That's the document. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about it. That's a sort of the document that says, hello world, hello company, we got a new project in town, right? That's strictly if you're under a PMO office. Every company doesn't require a charter, but here's a big thing. Once you receive your PMP credentials and a company brings you in, an organization brings you in, and they know you, if they don't say, if you look at that process chart, we went over that process chart yesterday, right? Initiating, you're supposed to do 2 things in initiating, right? You develop a charter and you start identifying your stakeholders. Then you move your team over to planning. No one's going to tell you to do that stuff when they bring you in, but as a PMP, credentialed individual, and as a practitioner of this discipline, I don't care what industry you're in, you're expected to do this, right? And if you don't follow some of these principles and processes that's over in this little chart, which we're going through now, your project's eventually going to tank. Now, I think either Adam or Kevin asked us yesterday, do you have to follow this thing letter to the letter? No. Again, we talked about tailoring, right? But I did want to get that in there. Once you receive your, earn your PMP credentials, companies are going to expect you to follow some type of process. They're going to be watching, right? It happened to me. I worked on a project when I didn't have my PMP, and I was working on the same project after I got my PMP. And they expected a difference because of that, right? They didn't pay for it, and they didn't even pay for it. I paid for it, right? But the expectations were still there, right? So some of the tools for building a shared understanding about a project, a charter, which actually tells the organization itself, here's the project, here's what it's about, here's some of the high level deliverables and cost and things like that. We're going to cover charter. A project plan, right? These are some of the documents or outcomes or results that help you communicate a shared understanding, right? The kickoff meeting, right? We'll talk about that as well, which is where you bring the key stakeholders and your project team to, for the organization to say, hey, we're going to start this thing, right? And you normally do a kickoff meeting after you do a minimum, well, I wouldn't say a minimum, a medium amount of planning, right? Other ways to build a shared understanding is brainstorming. Again, we talked about T-shaped skills yesterday. That's where we have a breadth of knowledge on the adaptive side. Vision, that's sort of like a elevator pitch on the adaptive side, meaning Kanban, Scrum. Instead of a charter on the traditional side, they have more like a vision or elevator pitch statement on the adaptive side. XP metaphor, there's a concept out there called extreme programming, which is extreme XP. When they say XP metaphor, that's sort of like an elevator pitch in their terminology. Product box exercises, again, high level elevator pitch. Okay. In other words, everything up here is tools and outcomes that you can put out on SharePoint. It's some kind of document that says, hey, this is what this project is about. Okay. Again, moving forward, we're talking about product vision, which we just spoke about. Project vision, right? Again, that's a desired end state. In other words, we just heard some individuals, some of your classmates here talk about their projects and what the end result was. That's why I always kept asking, okay, what's the end result of that, right? That's the vision that you want to keep sharing, that end result, so that your team will understand, okay, we know what we're working for. I know how my little place, well, not little place, I know what my role and responsibility is and how it fits into the bigger picture, right? So the vision itself, again, is sort of like the North Star, so to speak, to long story short, right? And again, you got various components within that, right? And they change, rapidly according to the approach. It could be the traditional approach, which you have to go through change management, but the adaptive approach, change can come at any time. But nonetheless, there's some type of North Star, some kind of, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, right? So you want to keep communicating that. It's called the project vision. From a traditional standpoint and a little bit on the adaptive side as well, we have what we call a project charter. I think, Maria, you said you worked in an EPMO office, so I know that was probably already set up. You had to develop a charter. I don't know if she's on the phone or on the. Maria, are you there? Because you talked about this yesterday a little bit. Has anyone worked in an environment where one of the processes was you have to develop a project charter? Anyone? Nope.
No, I haven't.
No. Okay.
Yeah, I can. This is Maria. Yeah, I had when I worked for the EPMO. That was one of the very first things we had to do was to create those charters and identify all of the people. This is where the RACI matrix that we talked about yesterday. This is where, where it came in handy because it gave a really good understanding of, at the end of the day, when the project was done, the way how I'd like to set up my projects was having a very clear understanding of, at the end of the day or at the end of the project, when we closed, that we really had identified who were the stakeholders, what needed to be done, and that everything was done to the satisfaction. I call them my clients, to the satisfaction of those stakeholders. So it was very important having that project charter from the very beginning.
Right. And that's what this document is about primarily. As you can see, the definition is just it's issued by the project initiator or sponsor, and it formally authorizes the existence of a project. In other words, in corporate, which is what I'm normally used to, but I worked a long time at Clark Atlanta University. There was no PMO office set up over there at all, right? Because it's all academia, right? That's what that was their service and results. So the project itself, I had to put things in place, almost like a mini or miniature PMO office. But anyway, for the purpose of the exam, this is the definition of a charter. This is the second document that you'll probably create in any project. The first one is if you think back, is that stakeholder register, right? Because on day one, you need to start identifying stakeholders. Well, same time, if you're looking at in the initiating process group of your process chart, there's two items. One is develop charter and one is identify stakeholders. Both of those documents, or both of those results or outcomes require a document. Well, for develop charter, this is it, okay? And like I said, there was corresponding PMO documents for everything that we produce. So there's actual charter out there. So what they're going to do next is have you take a look. This is what is in the contents of a charter. All your measurable objectives. At this point, we don't know much, right, about our projects because we're just starting out. So therefore, you'll always see the word high level. So high level requirements, high level project description, pre-approved financial resources, high level, risk, things like that. So these are some of the elements that will be in a project charter. Again, the charter itself is a document that authorizes the existence of a project to an organization. In other words, it's saying, hello world, we got a new thing coming out here, new project, okay? And this is your get as a project manager. You guys may or may not ever face that because you seem to be over in healthcare, most of you. And that's corporate as well, but that's different. With Cox Enterprises, Coca-Cola, that's a totally different beast, totally different animal. And these are for-profit organizations, and they don't play at all. I mean, if you're a project manager in there, and there's tons of projects going on constantly, they exist off of projects. It's not just the Coca-Cola or with Home Depot, just the tools and stuff. No, there are the actual projects that make those processes more seamless, right? Okay, so that's how you have to think of it. And that's why I'm bringing those examples from a corporate standpoint, because that's kind of the way they come at you on the exam, as you've kind of seen now through the exam simulator, right? Another form of communicating is what we call a project overview statement. All of it's the same, except for the charter. Charter is different. The charter is an actual document from a traditional standpoint that authorizes that a project exists. Project overview statement, again, that's just a written high-level elevator pitch that gives, one or two liner about what the project is, what it's going to produce. Okay. How to run a project. That's what we're going through now. Again, we got traditional, agile, or hybrid, right? We're going to cover a lot of this later on with all three of them, right? But these are called project management methodologies or project approaches. Either it's traditional, agile, or adaptive, or hybrid, which is a combination of both. We started talking about that yesterday when we started talking about these situational questions, if you remember. Okay, kickoff meeting. All right. So once you have most of these elements in place, whether it's, your project vision, on the traditional side, you definitely have to have that charter before you have a kickoff meeting, right? And at a kickoff meeting, I don't know if any of you have ever been to one. I've ran a few of them. Quite a few of them with all my projects. That's when you bring in your project team. Just picture yourself at this big round table with your project team and a lot of your key stakeholders, right? And everybody, what I would do, everybody would have a copy of the charter, right? And we would actually have a kickoff meeting and have a presentation that goes over the charter. Okay, so real quick, because this is kind of important.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm curious, is there a difference between the statement of work and the project charter?
Depends on the organization. I've heard the word term statement of work. I've used. I mean, normally it's a contract between an outside vendor and yourself, right? But I've heard depends on the organization. Depends on the organization. I've heard this term used as a project charter, but in theory, for the purpose of the exam, two different things.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, this is a project I did, one of the last projects I did with Fulton County School System. We did an online enrollment system. I did this maybe 6 years ago or something like that. So at the kickoff meeting, I'm just trying to give you a visual. After the charter was written and we gathered some information, we would bring in, well, in this one, we had about 30 key stakeholders and another 30 on the online, because in school districts, especially Fulton County down here in Atlanta, well, every school district, you actually have districts, and it's maybe 40 or 50 in Fulton County. So we had a designated person, key stakeholder online as well as at the headquarters. We had about 20 people. So it was maybe 50 people online. Everyone had a copy of the charter. And, you know, had to put together, as project manager, senior project manager, I had to put together a presentation. It looked like this, right? So you're at the table and got people online. Everybody has a copy of the charter. Everybody's zoomed in who's remote, and you kick out the agenda and make sure they understand the purpose, the approach, ground rules for the project. SunGuard was our third-party consultant. They produced the actual online application. And it was actually for students who work from home as well. There was a separate application for students who not work from home, but did homeschooling, right? Then next step. So this was our agenda for the kickoff meeting. So introductions, the Fulton County School System project team. I was a project manager. Then we had the SunGuard project team, which is the outside consultant. Make sure they got introduced themselves. Was a high level schedule. This is just giving you a visual. There's going to be several visuals that I give you throughout, right? In case any of you haven't done this before. So this is the kickoff meeting. It's one of the first major meetings that you have in a project, right? We actually was going to kick the project off in January 15. I'm not going to read through all of this, but implement online enrollment. Then we're going to do a pilot, an actual pilot. In other words, we're going to kick out maybe 10, 12 schools out of the 120 something schools that was out there, right? Here were some of the key milestones and deliverables. This is what you're communicating out to some of these key stakeholders, right? This is what they need to see. This was our approach. We're talking about approaches now. So what I did was put together some timelines from a 1 to 2 week timeline, sort of like what we did yesterday. This was sort of agilistic, but not quite. It was a combination, it was a hybrid approach. And these are some of the things that we're going to deliver within 1 to 2 weeks, and then within 2 to 4 weeks, and then from 16 weeks on, right? So this was the project approach. So you're letting all the key stakeholders know this is what's coming, okay? Ground rules for the project itself. And at this point, I turned it over to our outside consultants, which was SunGuard. And they also had a remote project manager working with me. That was my direct contact. So you let them speak and then tell the team what's the next step. So this is a format that I always follow, no matter what project I was working on or what industry I was working on the project in or what company, right? So that's just something, one of my repeats. So that's what that would look like at a kickoff meeting. Okay. Get back to where. Okay, from the perspective of the adaptive side of the house, instead of a kickoff meeting, they would have what they call a sprint planning meeting or an iteration planning meeting. When you see sprint planning or anything that says sprint on the exam or any questions on the exam or even on the exam simulator, sprint, you want to think of Scrum, right? When you see the term iteration, you want to think of Agile. Those probably only going to be the two planning process on the adaptive side on the exam: sprint and Scrum, sprint and Agile. So sprint, you want to associate it with Scrum. Iteration, you want to associate it with Agile. That's something you might want to jot down, or you're going to see it so much on this course content that it's going to become.
Can you repeat that one more time?
When you see the term sprint planning or sprint review or sprint anything, that's under Scrum. Think of Scrum. You're under the Scrum framework, okay? When you see the term iteration, like iteration planning, that's the same thing as in sprint planning, but it's Agile. So when you see the term iteration, it's Agile. When you see the term sprint, I don't care what it is, sprint, whatever, Scrum. what you'll, once you, again, you got that book, the chapter 4 in your exam prep book. Remember that's all about Agile. And then you have your Agile practice guide that's embedded within your PMBOK. Once you go over those, read those things once, all this will make sense. Okay. But just for now, just know iteration, term iteration, think of Agile, sprint, Scrum. So anyway, the point is relating kickoff meetings is normally done under traditional waterfall or predictive project management. Sprint and iteration planning, that's their version of the kickoff. They're about to kick off a sprint. They're about to kick off an iteration. Remember, their sprints and iterations are only 2 to 4 weeks long. Under traditional, those projects can last years. Think about traditional projects building a bridge. That's 2 to 5 years, right? But here we're talking about 2 to 4 weeks. So sprint planning, their little kickoff meeting, so to speak, is very short, and they start to work. Okay, so every time any kind of ceremony comes up, like the kickoff meeting, right behind it, they're going to tell you on the adaptive side what's happening. So kickoff meeting on the traditional side, sprint planning on the adaptive side. Okay. This is what we just talked about. They're called ceremonies. They're not really called meetings under the adaptive frameworks. And again, adaptive means Scrum, Agile frameworks, Kanban, Lean, DSDM, things like that, right? So they're called ceremonies. So a sprint planning meeting is really a sprint ceremony. I know we're backtracking here, but overall they're just called ceremonies. Okay. And again, once you read those documents and your coursework, it'll start to make sense, because this methodology, this framework, Agile and Scrum, it is extremely simple. Traditional, that's extremely hard. That's everything on this process chart. That's something else. This is pretty simple. So once you take a good read of that, trust me. I mean, you were answering questions on it yesterday without even reading it. Okay, more Agile ceremonies. One of them, if you remember yesterday in that little circle of things here, one of the first meetings was sprint planning. Let me go back. Was a sprint planning meeting, right? One of the second ceremonies was that, remember that little daily stand-up meeting, 15-minute meeting every single day. I don't care if it is, I remember you can't skip a day. Every day, 15-minute stand-up meeting. That's the second ceremony. Then you have the sprint review where the team actually does a display of whatever you're building. Okay. They do a review of whatever you're building, the product, the result. Then you have the sprint retrospective. All right. So you have the sprint planning meeting, then you have your daily stand-up, then you have your sprint review, and then you have your sprint retrospective. Okay. These are called ceremonies. Okay. Task boards. We talked about this earlier. Same thing as sort of a Gantt chart, if you had to compare something. The one thing about Agile and Scrum, these task boards or storyboards or story maps, that's the one single thing that everything is based off of. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But the task board, it's again, is a visualization of where you are. Remember, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. 3 columns. Here's the to-do list. Here's the work in progress. And here's what's been done. Here's what's been completed. Right. So in an Agile, Scrum, Kanban, any adaptive framework, they're supposed to be located in the same room. And around the walls are these task boards that has some information on it. So again, transparency, if you remember from some of the principles and value sets from the Agile Manifesto, transparency is one of them, right? What they mean by that is all your work is displayed. In traditional project management, the project manager holds on to that project schedule, which has that Gantt chart, right? You can hide that. That's easy to hide. Total opposite on the adaptive measure. You want everything to be transparent. Okay, we've talked about this before, those decision-making techniques. One is called consensus. So this is another one of those things that's kind of out of place in my opinion. I don't know why they put that there, but here's the definition of their version of consensus. And reaching a consensus, we talked about this yesterday, fist of 5, Roman voting, polling, dot voting. This was covered yesterday. This is going to come up a little later on. So this is not necessary right now. Estimation techniques. Somebody brought this up yesterday, the t-shirt sizing thing. I think that might have been Maria. I don't know. But planning poker, what you're estimating here is the size of whatever work you're doing. Your story points. We're going to cover this right after we take a break here. So keep in mind, estimation techniques, planning poker. This is not something you got to remember for the exam, by the way. But you're estimating the size of the work that you're getting ready to do. Remember, I brought up the example yesterday about the kitchen versus the 50 by 50 ballroom floor. I take the ballroom floor because I'll be finished with that in 10 minutes, but the kitchen was probably going to take a couple of hours, right? XP metaphor. Again, there's a concept out there under the adaptives called extreme programming. This is something that's not going to come up on your exam for the most part. Again, a metaphor is like the same thing as a common vision or the elevator pitch, but it's under extreme programming, which is another methodology. Product box collaboration. We talked about, these are the methodology. Well, these are the elevator pitches of different frameworks. Product box, again, is just a high level description of your project or product. All right, this is the end of module 1. We're going to get into the big one, module 2.